Okay, the ground textures, sorry, base textures. Those 5 make up one ecosystem. The color is quite self-explanatory, right? It's a color. The height handles what the elevation of our landscape is. The normal gives us a bit more surface definition and shading detail and such. But the 2 interesting maps here are the distribution and index map. The distribution map lets us define what kind of object set gets scattered on what color, so we can really define where cliffs are, where the forests are, and so on and so on. While the index map, also a very funky, colorful map that is really for allowing us to lay out the ground materials, which is up to 16. As a comparison to what you guys have seen on the previous moons, like a year ago, this was only 3. So we have ramped up the definition. Now we're gonna, as I said, we're gonna focus on the base textures, but not all of them, really just the color and the height map. Before we start off, like the one you see in the top left corner, and chain them up together to a bigger graph. Those nodes can be anything from shapes, patterns, modifiers of all sorts, right? Might be too technical, but I'll give you a quick example. So we started off with this very simple, I'm gonna actually go back. We start off with a simple spherical shape up here. And what we do is we take another pattern, a second pattern, and we just blend them together, right? So that's 2 nodes we just combine together to produce a new result. But it doesn't have to stop there. We can basically go on and on and on until we create an extremely huge graph that does something extremely sophisticated and detailed and complicated. But again, we're going to keep it simple. For example, adding a blur, right? So it just takes the result and blurs it, right? Okay, to do something a little more funky, we add a little twist to our result using a swirl node to create this, blossom or vortex kind of shape. What you see here is all I have done is I swapped that spherical shape that we have used in the beginning and swapped it for a star. So all the other nodes that I've used, like the blending of that second pattern, the blurring, the twisting, it gets reapplied without me having to go in and do all these steps again, right? And this is where the power of that tool comes from. This is what really enables us to do really quick iterations and variations of all sorts. But still, this might be too abstract. I'm going to follow up with another example later on that. Let me talk about other kinds of noses, not noses, but noises, which is called the Perlin noise. It's another node, right? I mentioned to you earlier that this might be shapes or patterns or all kinds of images, really. Noises are fundamental for building procedurally generated contents. For example, materials. Substance design is, in most game productions, used to create materials. But in our case, we want to achieve landscapes. So it's a bit of a different use case here. This Perlin noise is not really a static image that's saved somewhere on my drive, but a mathematically generated pattern. And more detail to this wobble shape. All right. So we've added more detail to this wobble shape. But it doesn't really, get me anywhere. I want to use it as a base to, create my landscape from. So what I'll do is repeat that process a couple times and then see where we end up with. All right. This is a bit more detailed and, somehow resembles noisy, generic-looking hills of some sort. I bet this can be useful in later steps to get closer to our result. Before we start off, I'd like to show you another type of noise. It's basically the same, the same idea, the same method. It is a pattern, a mathematically generated pattern. But it's just a different kind. There's all kinds of patterns or types of these Perlin noises, right? So this one is, for example, called billowy. And if we add details on top, the octaves that I was speaking of earlier, then it gives us something like this. which looks kind of like a bumpy, hilly landscape surface, but it's really too generic, so we will have to work on that quite heavily to get a really nice and sophisticated result. The next one is a ridged noise, and same thing. We add the details on top and get kind of, right? So we're taking this noise and we're plugging it into our erosion node, and we get this. So with added erosion, you can see how we start getting closer to a mountainous landscape with visible erosion channels everywhere. What it also can do is apply sedimentation. So now you can see that if I apply, or if I put an input to the sediment strength input, I can actually get the soil, the soil being basically transported down the slopes, accumulating in the valleys, giving us a much smoother look of that environment. Okay, I think you guys get an idea how this stuff works and what noises are, and let's create something very, very quick and simple with it that has a bit more intent. So we take this noise, sorry, let me go back. We take this noise and we apply it back onto a spherical shape up there, right? This is the same thing we did earlier, it's just another noise. Then we add more contrast to that shape, so it basically tightens up and gives us a better silhouette. Also introduces this plateau because we increased the contrast by so much that it basically clips out of range. So, to produce something a little more interesting, we can put it in a mask that describes all slopes, that's the slope information of that mountain, and apply erosion only there. To visualize where we might do this, or where we might go with this mountain in general, let's add in 2 colors to visualize a bit more context. See, really just 2 colors, very quick. Okay, so do you guys remember the previous example where I basically swapped out the spherical shape for the star? What we can also do is multiple stars. Or add any generic noise to it to see what kind of results we get from this graph that we have set up now. And this is where it gets really playful, because it's always interesting to plug in random things and see what we get out of it. We can, of course, go completely crazy with this. All right, but it's time to actually build and apply erosion to it, but this time it looks a bit different. It looks way smoother, much more rough, because I use different settings on it. The reason I do this is, as artists, we always try to go from rough and large shapes and really, define how these are supposed to look like or how we want them to look like, and then work ourselves through to the tiny, granular details on our environments. What I do next is I'm adding a flat surface, which has a little bit of bumpiness to it. I'm basically blending these 2 in to improve the balance between hills and flatland. In the next step, I'm doing what we have already done in previous examples. I'm adding noise and I'm eroding it down. I'm adding noise again and I'm eroding it down. So I do that twice. You see up there the noise, blend, erosion, noise, blend, erosion. In the next step, this is not very visible, but let's look at this top left hill over there. You see how we are adding this sand layer at the bottom of the slope, like wind has a blown sand against the slope. So this is that one. But I kind of like the idea and take it to more extreme levels. So I decided to basically utilize a shadow node. So just to explain quickly, imagine there's a sun on the top left corner, high frequency detail and flat shapes that provide for a little bit more eye rest. The next detail isn't really super visible, but you can kind of see it, right? Again, we are simply utilizing a noise. We're adding it everywhere where there are slopes, and then we're blurring it down the slopes. I want to create adding tiny bumps and crevices to our sand slopes. The next step is another detailed step, as I'm overall quite happy with the large shapes, so I won't try to touch them or destroy them any further. This one is adding a little more bumps, like this little tiny bit of granular detail. And this is all height information. Whatever I put into this pass, you guys will see in the game. So every single tiny bump I add in here, you will actually see as a bump on the environment. You see how this one is getting really noisy and detailed. This is the very, very last bit of fine granular noise I'm adding here. You see that the nodes at the top left have suddenly changed to another color. This is not the height information anymore. This is the normal map information. This is surface detail that will be visible to you guys, but will not. This is quite easy. Over time, whenever the graph is done, it's getting quite big. And you have set up a lot of masks that you can to create a nice looking texture. So here I'm basically adding another hue of sand to create a bit more miscoloration to avoid having the entire ecosystem look too flat. In the next one, we're taking all the rocky or the rocky surface that still show details coming from our erosion pass back then, and coloring them in proper cliff-like in a cliff-like color palette, something more rocky. We're adding another layer of noise, but at this point I noticed, well, I'm adding too much of noise. It's getting too noisy, so it's not as readable anymore. So I'm knocking it a bit back without destroying it completely. So I'm basically reducing it by 80%. And to give it a little bit of a detail, something otherworldly, I'm adding this crazy blue to it because I can. All right, so this is our final ecosystem that we have just created in Substance Designer. A couple more views of it. And then we get something like this. Simply by changing one node, we can change the entire look and feel of that environment. Suddenly it feels less barren, but much more friendly, almost like a jungly place. Or this one, which could be a volcanic, place where lava, of course, apply the same thing here. The camera is set to some very, very slow. See? All right. And now we can jump down to the surface. See? This is how our height information looks like on the planet now. But of course, we have created a color, so we will have to add it to our environment. We can do so by adding the textures that we have created. All right, there's the color. The blue looks kind of cool. I really like the idea. But if we look at, basically if we zoom down to the surface, you see we get the default materials that come from our editor. And if I zoom out a little more, it really isn't holding up with all the detail because our ecosystems are only a 1024 pixels by 1024 pixels big. And an ecosystem can be around 3 to 6 kilometers wide. So there's really not enough pixels for us to to provide you guys with all the details and make it believable. What we can do is add the distance textures back in that we talked about previously, or at the beginning of the presentation, right? So these textures are really meant to add in that detail that we're missing. Let's jump to another spot. And zoom out. Okay, that looks good, right? The distance textures are taking over. I'm zooming out. Then the ecosystem textures are taking over. I'm going to do the reverse. This is good, 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 good. All good. Oh. Right? Materials, which I'll do now. All right. Let's do the same. Cool, 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 cool. All good. Back to the ground. All right. Awesome. Seems like all the views, so basically whenever you fly towards the ecosystem, you fly down to the ecosystem, you see some kind of detail at all times without it getting too blurry until you reach the ground. Yeah. So what I want to show you here is a little something that players usually don't get to see, which is a debug mode for that map that I was talking about, which is the index map. You see it says 8, 7, 6, 5, 4. It's not a countdown. It's really just telling us this is the 4th slot of your ground materials, the 5th slot of your ground materials, and such. What I want to point out here is the way they blend together is really quite simple. Right now it's splotches of ground materials. And I want to give that one a bit more definition. So what we can do is we have something in our editor. I'm not going to explain it in further detail, but it basically mixes all these channels up to provide us with even more breakup. Cool, right? So I'm showing you guys this in this debug view because whenever we use a sand texture next to a sand texture, this might not be very, very visible. So this one makes it quite clear. Cool. So as you see, texture-wise, our entire ecosystem kind of works, but it's kind of empty, right? It's boring. So let's add a couple object presets to it. First, we add the larger shapes. As I mentioned to you before during the ecosystem presentation or creation process, we're working on the big stuff first, on the big silhouettes first, and then we work ourselves through the details. So we add these larger piles. Then let's try to see what's up with these bluish areas in our ecosystem. All right, I'm going to add a couple weird-looking plants to it. Right? Okay. All right. This is but this is not going to do the cut. Okay, I can see them working from a distance already, but I'm not too happy with these cliffs, so I'm going to add a bit more definition to the cliffs using assets, of course, as this is what we're doing right now. Okay. Okay. This is starting to look better. Now that we have defined all our main objects, we can really go in and detail things out, right? So let's snap to a random location and see what we can add in terms of detailed meshes. Okay, cool. We added a couple pebbles and grass. It really adds up to the ground materials. Some things, of course, as it's a flat, those meshes really help us out, and they weld together all the other objects that sit on top the larger structures together. So whenever you have a rock, for example, you expect tinier rocks to be scattered around it, transitioning into some kind of gravel and really creating this. Let's see what we can add here. Good. So, as I told you before, right? So, if we were just to leave these alien plants, cacti kind of looking flora just by itself, it would look kind of weird. It doesn't have a context. It's just sitting on a blue surface, right? But this grass here is really giving it the context it needs to really work fine in the environment. Same with this plating here. It really bumps up the terrain detail by a lot and makes these guys sit much better in the scene. All right. Cool, so this is the very last object set that we added, right? You see that the detail has become quite detailed now. If I zoom out, you never get the feeling of, or you never get to see a very blurred out environment. So this is working quite fine. But I was kind of jumping in between places, so let's have a look at the entire process from this view again. We added our height map. We added our texture. We added our distance textures. We added our ground materials. We did additional breakup. We added all our big objects and all our detail objects. Let's get back to the textures. And now, again, back to everything else, like the final result. So this would be the before and after, right? This is how we at CIG go through our environments and try to build them up step by step. Whoa. All right. Let's have a run through our environment. What do you guys want to see? I seem to have forgotten to set the gravity on the planet. Let's see how that behaves. Jump over it? No. Okay, cool. I think this works quite fine. What do you guys think?